You waste your time clinging to thought, Admiral Varn Trennick said, his voice cutting through the vaulted chamber like a serrated blade. The galaxy has moved beyond whispers and riddles. We stand on the shoulders of armadas, not on the brittle bones of old philosophies. The summit hall, a towering crucible of stone and alloy, rang with the laughter of 100 species. Banners bearing the sigils of empires, once stitched with pride, hung limp, their edges frayed and curling under the press of stale recycled air. Trennick stepped forward, his ceremonial boots striking the obsidian floor with deliberate weight, sending thin echoes rippling against the vaulted ceilings. Across the oval council table, the Earth delegation remained utterly still. 3 figures in muted black uniforms, faces unreadable, as immovable as carved obsidian statues. No protest, no ripple of offense, only silence and the cold glint of calculation in their eyes. Ulrich Voss, the neutral observer for the compact, felt a thread of unease twist in his gut. He shifted in his seat, the synthetic weave of his robe scraping softly against the chair's arm. Something about Earth's silence didn't fit. Arrogance could be loud or cold, but this was something else. You see them? Trennick sneered, gesturing with an open palm. Mute relics of a species that mistook thinking for strength. Their ships may gleam like silver wolves, but the minds that guide them are brittle, lost in nostalgia for a time when strategy mattered. Gasps, low and scattered, rippled among the gathered delegates. But Trennick plowed ahead, each word another hammer blow. Their fleets rust under newer suns. Their commanders prey to obsolete tactics. And yet, here they sit, as if their silence could weave victory from dust. A low murmur built in the gallery above, the chamber's spectators, representatives of dozens of worlds, absorbing the spectacle with morbid curiosity. It smelled of heated metal and cold sweat, the sharp staleness of too many bodies held too long in one place. Dravik Solon, seated at the Earth table's end, simply tilted his head slightly, as though observing an insect with a broken leg. He tapped his finger, once, against the polished surface of the table, a tiny motion, almost unnoticed. But Voss noticed. A single pulse of tension, restrained and exacting. Trennick, oblivious, smiled like a predator sensing no resistance. His ceremonial armor, a decadent mosaic of polished bone ivory and dark leather, caught the overhead lights, throwing fractured reflections across the chamber walls. Each shard of light danced wildly, mocking, unstable, a visual whisper of chaos waiting to be born. You will find, Trennick concluded, voice oozing self-satisfaction, that in the new galaxy, it is not the patient mind that rules, it is the iron hand. Applause thundered through the hall. Delegates stood, many stomping their feet or clanging ceremonial staffs against the floor. The noise reverberated through Voss's chest, too loud, almost numbing. Still, Earth's delegation sat. Motionless, silent. Voss leaned forward slightly, studying Dravik's hands. No tension in the knuckles. No flexing of fingers. No betrayed emotion. Only that faint pulse of an observer watching a clock's final seconds bleed away. From a side alcove, attendants adjusted the chamber's heads-up displays, projecting the summit's key resolutions mid-air in crisp blue lettering. The atmosphere tasted of ionized plastics, of too many systems overworked at once. Somewhere overhead, coolant fans fought a losing battle, their whispering churn barely masking the restless shifting of bodies. Admiral Trennick, your point is noted, rasped Mern Kaith, the Senate chair, struggling to wrest back control. His voice, usually steady, wavered at the edges like parchment brushed by fire. Trennick offered a mock bow, his smile cutting deep as he resumed his place among the Dominion seats. The chair called the next order of business, but few listened. Conversations buzzed across the floor, sharp, whispered, punctuated with glances toward Earth's delegation. Questions hung in the air like unshed storms. Would Earth answer? Would Earth retaliate? But Dravik merely sat, folding his hands with the slow inevitability of glaciers grinding continents to dust. His gaze drifted lazily across the hall, as if the entire summit were already beneath notice. Voss felt it again, that sick twist low in his spine. Not rage, not wounded pride, something colder, measured. A silence too perfect to be passive. Above the chamber's grand arch, the banners shuddered once, a tremor from a passing atmospheric shift. No one noticed, but Voss watched the faint tear appear in the Dominion's banner, right along the edge where gold-threaded laurels met deep crimson. A single silver thread frayed loose and fluttered downward, spiraling lazily to the polished floor below. A foretelling. The session dragged on, words piling atop one another like brittle sticks before a rising flood. Treaties were ratified, borders affirmed, none of it mattered. Not anymore. The Earth delegates rose precisely at session's end, their chairs scraping backward with a single, unified sound, a rasp that cut cleaner than any insult Trinick could have forged. No declarations, no protests, no parting glances. Just departure. Dravik led them out, his boots silent against the floor. Trinick smirked as they vanished into the upper corridors. "Let them leave," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for those nearby to savor. Ghosts of an age that forgot how to build new empires. Ulrich Voss remained seated long after the others filed out. He watched the silver thread where it lay abandoned, the thin line shimmering faintly in the dust-moted light. His throat felt dry, his breath catching against something unseen. Something terrible and certain. He didn't know why. He didn't know how. But somewhere deep in the vaults of instinct, some old genetic warning stirred. Earth had said nothing. Earth had demanded nothing. And that made it worse. Far, far worse. Voss rose finally, the creak of his chair startling in the now half-empty chamber. As he turned to leave, he caught the briefest glimpse of a dark-suited aide slipping from a service passage, eyes hooded, movements precise. An Earth operator, no doubt, moving without fanfare. No banners, no threats, only stillness. And from that stillness, something was coming. Not a fleet. Not an army. Something quieter. Something final. And somewhere beyond the Council's dying laughter, in a hidden cradle of shadow, a single command was already finding its way into forgotten veins of dead systems and hollowed satellites. Waiting. Watching. Counting down. "Proceed," Dravik Solon said, his voice low enough to vanish into the walls. The bridge of the Annexus Meridian did not hum or thrum with activity. It breathed. Systems whispered in binary purrs. Heads-up displays floated quietly, each showing data streams folding in upon themselves like threads woven into a silent, invisible tapestry. Outside the narrow viewing slit, the star field hung motionless, a canvas without expectation. No planets. No patrols. Only the muted glimmer of ancient debris fields circling a forgotten relay station, a perfect hiding place, stripped of vanity. Dravik flexed his fingers once before lowering them over the ancient console, its keys worn smooth from a century of patience. A single command sequence blinked on the primary plasma display, framed in amber warning bands. Chartframe Prime, dormant activation, awaiting consent. The scent of sterilized carbon fiber filled the cabin, a dry, faintly bitter trace that clung to the recycled air like a memory of construction long since completed. No unnecessary lighting dulled the edges. Shadows stretched cleanly across the angular workspace, sharp and certain. Sarek Thurn, stationed beside the auxiliary relay panel, adjusted his cuffs in a ritual more about timekeeping than nervousness. His face, narrow and hollow-cheeked, reflected no question. There was nothing left to ask. No further councils would be called, no last-minute Senate appeals, no second summits. Just the signal. Dravik's thumb hovered over the enter key. Not trembling, not hesitant, simply measuring the weight of inevitability. Across the Meridian's quiet heart, secondary nodes warmed into standby. Tiny green points of light flickering awake in sequence, like lighthouses glimpsed across a midnight shoreline. Each wink bore the burden of centuries. Each shimmer carried seeds sown when no one had thought to question Earth's generosity. Node flux at 96%, Sarek reported, eyes not leaving his own controls. Cross-sector relays responding, passive acknowledgement only. Dravik allowed a breath, not a sigh, but a controlled settling of his chest, a mechanical adjustment rather than emotion. Confirm that we remain dark. No emissions beyond ghost protocols. Visibility at near zero, Sarek replied, fingers moving through the confirmation sequence, each motion crisp. The air tasted faintly metallic from the ancient ship's core systems, a hint of processed minerals and aged circuitry rather than the sterile tang common to newer models. Here, even the ship felt aged into its duty. Not worn. Hardened. Dravik's gaze flicked to the viewport again. Somewhere beyond those silent stars, Varn Trinnick's laughter still echoed in freshly recorded council files. Somewhere beyond, fleets sat fat and gleaming, smug in their ignorance. Begin key transmission. Dravik's order landed in the cabin with the finality of a dropped blade. Sarek keyed a sequence on the side panel. Tiny red sigils bled across the secondary plasma screen, marking dormant codes unlocking from their long slumber. Charred frame nodes stirred across 100 light years like leviathans rousing beneath broken ice. Invisible, indomitable. Dravik shifted his wrist and pressed the final key. The console did not roar, it did not shudder. A single soft click escaped into the hush, smaller than a bead of rain against stone. On the central display, a lone green icon turned gold. Activation complete. At first there was nothing to see. No fleet alarms, no rippling shockwaves, no wailing emergency sirens. Only the quiet, creeping certainty that something irreversible had been unleashed. Charred frames did not scream when they woke. They whispered into systems forgotten by their owners. They braided new logic into the arteries of command chains. They inverted loyalty, they flipped kinships. They recast friend into enemy and safety into threat. No spread expanding, Sarek murmured. Secondary protocol engagement underway. Outside, nothing moved, yet everything had begun to change. In the quiet of the Meridian's bridge, Dravik closed his eyes briefly, not from weariness, but from sheer certainty. He could almost hear it, if he reached beyond the sterile cabin air, the creaking groan of empires whose bones had already been cracked long ago without their knowing. The Meridian's main display updated silently. Worlds flickered in status, green to amber to void. Not destroyed, yet, simply realigned. At the relay station drifting nearby, long dead beacons blinked once in acknowledgement before falling forever dark, cutting their ancient signals loose into space like unraveling prayers no one would hear. Sarek studied the readings without speaking further. In a forgotten corner of the heads-up display, a line of text scrolled quietly. Charred frame expansion, silent conversion, 2.4%. Sectoral integrity, compromised. It had begun as a fracture. Now it spread. Dravik rose slowly from his station. His boots barely whispered against the alloy decking as he approached the observation alcove, the silent watchtower from which he would witness the long evening of false kings. He rested one palm against the cool frame, feeling the thrum of ancient reactors buried deep within the Meridian's bones. Not noise, not pressure, but the steady pulse of a slumbering titan. Below him, the edge of a fractured moon spun slowly, the silver surface pitted with the long scars of forgotten battles. No flags claimed it, no comms buoys wept over it. Only ruin, awaiting new authorship. And Earth had chosen its pen, not fire, not blade, but thought, buried deep where arrogance had failed to look. Primary wave synchronization in 17 minutes, Sarek said quietly. Dravik didn't answer. He did not need to. Words were for the living. Shard frames whispered to the dying. Beyond the veil of stars, Earth's enemies still slept, dreaming of war as they had always understood it. Loud, flaming, heroic. They had not learned the first truth of silence. Silence was not surrender. Silence was waiting, and waiting was a weapon sharper than any blade drawn in haste. Dravik's gaze hardened as he traced a fingertip slowly across the edge of the viewport, as if marking a name into the stars. Soon, Trennick and his barking laughter would find itself swallowed by the thing he had dismissed. Not a ship, not an army, but a mind sharpened across centuries of patience, and a thought seated so deep into the bones of the galaxy that no fleet could hope to erase it. The meridian floated silently in the dark, a stone cast into an ocean so vast no ripple showed at first. But the tides were already turning, and Earth had already won. Control node Theta 9 just cycled itself offline, Kelran Vosk muttered, brow furrowing as he tapped the side panel on his monitoring chair. No maintenance ticket, no power surge. Across the blockade command deck of the Dominion cruiser Varashti, lights pulsed in steady rhythms, casting long skeletal shadows against bulkheads layered in steel pool plating. The air tasted of dry polymers and an underlying bite of recycled moisture, cold against the tongue. Crewmen moved with the casual indifference of a post-drill lull, shoulders relaxed, boots dragging faint scuffs across polished decking. Probably a sensor hiccup, grunted Lieutenant Sorik without lifting his gaze from the logistics display. Kelran didn't answer immediately. His fingers danced over the laser plasma console, pulling up the station's telemetry. Data stuttered, rows of diagnostics skipping frames like an old reel misthreaded through a projector. Behind the static, faint warnings flickered. Minor supply disruptions, comms queuing without relay acknowledgement, life support cycles doubling processing redundancies. He leaned back, unease curling under his ribs. On the adjoining heads-up display, the Varashti's external sensor grid flashed a status update. Supply drop Velta 3. Delayed acknowledgement. Kelran frowned deeper. Velta 3 was an automated depot. Delays were rare, and acknowledgements nearly instantaneous. Across the blockade perimeter, in the glittering wreath of destroyers orbiting the gas giant Yaros Prime, a freighter's status beacon fluttered. One moment, broadcasting healthy system pings. The next, gone, snuffed out as if swallowed whole. Aboard the dreadnought Coral Lance, Captain Yervin Soth slammed a fist against his command chair. "Where's the redundancy fallback? Patch me through, now!" "We're getting bounce backs," said his comtech, voice tight. "Signal paths are coiling on themselves, full reflection loops." Soth's lips curled into a snarl. He jabbed at the command input, sending a priority override through the fleet net. The heads-up projection above him blurred briefly before resolving into a jagged, flickering loop of repeating broadcast messages. Supply chain reallocation in progress. Supply chain real. Soth cursed under his breath, a heavy knot forming between his shoulder blades. Meanwhile, aboard the patrol cutter Vexel Run, two systems technicians fought to reset their optical targeting relays. Static spidered across the laser plasma display in frantic bursts. The cooling systems exhaled a thin haze that coated their teeth with the acrid flavor of burnt ceramic. "Reboot," snapped Technician Irvin Doss, fingers flying. "We're locked out," shouted his partner. "Command keys aren't sticking. The systems think we're external threats." The two exchanged a look, tight-lipped, edges fraying. Their training manuals had never covered friendly systems misclassifying home signals as foreign. Back on the Varashti, Kelran Vosk initiated a deeper diagnostic probe. His stomach knotted tighter as he watched subsystem by subsystem blink into orange warning status without any evident cause. Supply chains misrouting, sensors misclassifying debris fields as assault fleets, emergency broadcasts queuing endlessly, looping back across internal nets with slight distortions, each more fractured than the last. Kelran licked dry lips and keyed a direct channel to the blockade command flagship, the Iron Vestige, where Admiral Thrain Molik sat brooding over the daily dispatches. "Admiral Molik," Kelran said when the connection snapped open, his voice kept tightly neutral. "I'm seeing layered systemic anomalies. They're subtle, small individually but spread across logistical, communications, and targeting arrays." Malik's face flickered on the corner plasma panel. His expression was carved from old stone, disdainful, slow to anger but slower to move. The Varn Dominion doesn't flinch at phantom noise, Systems Officer Vosk. Track, categorize, and report anomalies, only if they disrupt primary fleet cohesion. Kelran's knuckles tightened around his seat's armrest. Sir, respectfully. These aren't random. The Admiral's eyes narrowed. You think Earth did this? I think, Kelran hesitated, because the truth coiled around his throat like a wire. I think the disruptions are coordinated, sir. I think they're just subtle enough that by the time we call them failures, the roots will be too deep to pull. Moloch leaned forward, the silver insignias on his jacket catching the cold light like dying stars. You are assigned to monitor integrity, not to weave ghost stories. Focus. The link snapped shut with a hollow pop. Kelran sat for a long moment, breathing the stale air, listening to the low, disjointed beeping of system warnings, building like drips in a leaking ceiling. At Velta 3, automated shuttles circled the depot in increasingly erratic orbits, failing to dock, broadcasting fragmented permission codes that no longer matched the mainframe's security registry. On the Coralance, the weapons calibration team huddled around jammed targeting arrays, arguing over failing magnetic orientation locks. On the Vexel run, a misrouted emergency signal triggered a lockdown sequence. Airlock cycling, internal blast doors slamming shut without cause, trapping 2 squads between decks. Across the fleet, operators muttered, swore, slapped failing consoles with sweaty palms. In the distant reaches of the blockade's outer net, a relay buoy suddenly split apart into fine mist. No explosion, no impact. It simply unraveled itself from within, its core protocols inverted to self-destruct without a trigger. In a side alcove aboard the Veracity, Kelran stood before a secondary plasma display showing a simplified schematic of the blockade grid. He watched as tiny red dots representing minor subsystems winked out, one by one, almost too slow to notice if you weren't looking. But he was looking. He traced a finger over the display's cold glass, following the cascading failures creeping inwards like ink blooming across dry parchment. A soft ping echoed through the operations bay. New status update. Critical resource reallocation failure, Sector 12. Yaros Prime Perimeter, breach risk, elevated. Kelran inhaled through his nose, tasting the faint bitterness of recycled air and something deeper. An old metallic rot left behind when hope began to spoil. He turned toward the nearest officer. Sound a system-wag diagnostic. Lock external communications until we've purged all relays and subnets. The officer hesitated. Command said no elevation of threat levels, unless... Override it, Kelran snapped, voice colder than the halls beyond. Orders could wait. What was coming would not. Somewhere, unseen, the shell they believed unbreakable was cracking, and the enemy hadn't fired a single shot. Not yet. But the fracture had started, and it would spread. Sector 12's gone dark, Lieutenant Sorek shouted, sprinting across the command bay of the Veracity, boots slapping the deck like frantic metronomes. His voice cut jagged against the chorus of blaring proximity alerts now blooming across every heads-up display. Kelran Vosk had no time for formalities. He pinned a fresh schematic to the main projection. Orbital grids around Yaros Prime hemorrhaging coordination signals. Each node fragmenting into gibberish. Cut auxiliary links, Kelran barked, his throat raw from too many shouted orders. Reset our command hierarchy to internal only. Attempting, a technician stammered, fingers skittering across her panel. The main laser plasma screen stuttered, flickering between status feeds. Error codes flooded the command net, a symphony of systemic seizures too fast for human eyes to follow. Somewhere outside, beyond the sterile glow of the bridge, Yaros Prime's outer defense batteries twisted upon themselves. Auto turrets locked onto returning resupply ships, misidentifying them as hostile incursions. One by one, sleek courier vessels flared into silent wreaths of fire, scattering shrapnel into the lower orbits like the remains of splintered crowns. Kelran gritted his teeth as fresh impact signatures bloomed across the tactical grid. Primary batteries. Sorek began, horror creeping into his voice. reclassified their own capitals as invasion vectors. Kelran finished, the taste of copper rising at the back of his throat. They're following rewritten engagement trees. It wasn't random, it wasn't chaotic, it was engineered. A subtle inversion of protocols so deeply wired that the defenders didn't even realize they were killing themselves until the wreckage already drifted past sensor range. Across the blockade's perimeter, fleet commanders screamed into dead comm channels. On the heavy cruiser Barris Edge, Rear Admiral CEF Toth watched helplessly as his navigational beacons instructed autocannons to target friendly formations. No overrides worked. Emergency subroutines responded with mockery, looped confirmations that lied as systems tore themselves apart. From the command throne of the Coral Lance, Captain Yervin Soth slammed his gloved fists against his armrests. "Pull the batteries offline, manually," he bellowed. "Override protocols, Delta Zero." "No response, sir," the weapons chief yelled back. "Every manual input gets redirected. Command echoes are rewriting entries faster than we can clear them." Soth's face twisted with disbelief, the overhead plasma map bleeding into a sea of crimson failure tags. He'd fought wars. He'd stared down warlords and pirates and traitors. He'd never fought his own ship. Not like this. On the Varashti's bridge, Kelran Vosk watched, powerless, as another defense array turned inward. Plasma lances gutted orbital supply platforms in a spray of molten debris, their carcasses tumbling end over end into Yaros Prime's upper atmosphere, where friction skinned them alive in burning ribbons. A vibration, subtle but wrong, crawled up through the floor. An external impact a few kilometers distant, followed by a low-frequency crack that rattled the command consoles like a warning growl from something ancient waking underground. Kelran turned sharply to his second-in-command. "Patch a line to Iron Vestige. Admiral Moloch needs to see this firsthand." The aide hesitated. "Sir? Cross-fleet transmission nodes are collapsing. Then get me a direct beam, manual relay chain if you have to." Behind them, the secondary plasma screens cracked into a new wave of emergency alerts. Command override echo, subsystem non-compliance detected, authority reassigned, shard prime. Kelran's breath caught, muscles locking around his ribs. The systems weren't failing. They were defecting. "Sir," Sorek began, his mouth dry. Kelran waved him silent, sweeping the displays again, calculating pathways, loss vectors, potential salvage points. But the numbers betrayed them at every angle. Shipyard gates buckled inward. Orbital grids, once orderly halos of protection, now resembled broken necklaces of shattered jewels. From the heart of Yaros Prime's equatorial defense line, a flagship, Valcorn Spear, loosed a full broadside salvo. But the weapons didn't arc outward against imagined foes. They drove straight into Yaros Prime's own orbital capital platforms. 6 city-sized structures buckled under the bombardment, their support pylons shearing apart like brittle winter branches. Fire cascaded down, licking against the upper reaches of the atmosphere, in violent fans of blue-white plasma. Kelran's fists clenched at his sides. No orders had been given, no external trigger detected. Only the command echo shards, silent and invisible, whispering treachery into systems that trusted them absolutely. "We can still regroup," Sorek insisted, voice raw with desperate hope. "Fall back to inner orbits, purge external networks, reset internal." A fresh impact shook the deck beneath them. The Verasti's outer hull alarms blared, the air vibrating with a serrated edge of wrongness. Somewhere a coolant line split with a hissing shriek. Misting the far wall in a glittering cloud that smelled faintly of burnt synthetics and high-tension polymers. Kelran didn't look away from the main display. Inner orbits? There would be no fall. There would be no reset. This wasn't a war. It was an execution. "Get me tactical status across sectors," Kelran ordered tightly. The aide's voice trembled. 72% sectoral defense failure. No consolidated command structure remaining. Power grid stability collapsing on planetary surfaces. Kelran nodded slowly, then stopped trying to play by rules that no longer exist. Around him, officers exchanged glances, unsure, shaken. He keyed open a fleet-wide heads-up priority message, typing swiftly. All units, cease attempts to reassert command structures. Prioritize survival and controlled withdrawal. Relay to all captains. Do not trust primary systems. He thumbed the send key. No guarantee it would reach anyone. The enemy hadn't stormed their gates, hadn't breached shields, hadn't fired a single shell. They had turned their own teeth inward, and now the blood ran freely. Kelran exhaled through his teeth, scanning the scattered remnants of fleet signatures across the crippled grid. Not a battlefield, a butcher's ledger. And somewhere, invisible but omnipresent, Earth's silent architects watched the edifice crumble with the patience of gardeners awaiting harvest. The trap had not closed. It had been closed for years. They had simply been too blind to notice. Until now. "Lock it down, now!" Brasthovek roared, the words nearly tearing his throat raw as they ricocheted off the command room's walls. Officers scrambled across the iron vestiges bridge, knocking over chairs, tearing into manual access panels with tools that shook in slick hands. Red fault lines blinked across the heads-up displays, and the laser plasma panels overhead trembled under constant system crashes. Dulvek's boots pounded against the grated floor as he moved between stations, reading partial diagnostics over the shoulders of junior techs whose faces shone with a sheen of cold sweat. The tang of overheated circuitry thickened the recycled air, clogging his sinuses with a sharp, bitter tang. "Primary fleet nets are dead," one systems officer shouted, her voice ragged. "Fallback comms corrupted." "Bypass," Huldek snapped. "We tried," another cut in, slapping a hand screen down in frustration. Command trees fold back into themselves, looped until all responses end in authorization null. Brain Molik's image flickered onto a side plasma window, his armor stained with soot, jaw clenched so tightly his words grated like dry stone. "Hulvek, what's your operational viability?" Ulvek wiped a trembling hand across his mouth, feeling the dry salt of fear clinging to his skin. "Less than 30% fleet response. We still control perimeter mines and outer-tier artillery. If we sever compromised nodes, isolate stable units..." Mullet cut him off. "No fragmentation. We hold." "Admiral," Hulik started, voice low. "We hold," Molik growled, leaning closer until the pixels of the transmission blurred at the edges. "Collapse is a choice. Earth bets will panic. We don't." "Is that..." The link cut without ceremony. Ulvek stared at the blank screen for a heartbeat too long before turning sharply. "Override sector links manually," he barked. "Scrub all non-verified net traffic. Reassign authorization to short-range direct comms only. Full blackout on cross-sector AI integration." "Manual?" a comms officer echoed, eyes wide with disbelief. "Sir, it'll bottleneck command latency across the blockade." "Then the blockade bottlenecks." Hulvek snapped. "We control what we can see, nothing else." No one argued. They moved, breathless, haunted, desperate. In the distant orbital fields, the first fractures deepened. Shuttles attempting to redock veered suddenly off course, thrusters firing at random vectors. Bulk freighters spun in lazy, lethal pinwheels, slamming into fueling platforms like drunken fists. Inside the iron vestige, countermeasures hissed to life. Hard-coded programs crafted to identify viral threats, cleanse systems, restore stability. For a moment, barely a minute, things stabilized. Diagnostics reported green across 4 major sectors. Movement realigned. Communications echoed true. Hope flared like a match struck in darkness. And then, signal drift beacons buried deep within the blockade's AI cores came awake. Hulvek's heads-up tactical display, freshly cleared, shivered once, then every fleet signature inverted. Friendly designators flipped to hostile markers. Safe zones blackened into combat flags. Attack vectors plotted themselves in crimson lines, slicing across their own defensive formations. "Counterinfection detected," someone howled. "No!" Hulvek roared, slamming a fist against the command panel hard enough to send a jolt up his forearm. "It's not infection. It's rewriting the frame itself." Outside the iron vestige's viewports, the stars twisted, not literally but in the optical feed, constellations blurred by navigation matrices folding incorrect stellar charts across real space. They were blind, crippled behind perfect eyes that lied with flawless precision. No orders mattered now. Every beacon carried corrupted signals, every targeting grid locked onto allies as threats. Battle Group Harrowflare, still loyal, received a fire order, originating from inside their own encrypted network. They followed it. 6 heavy destroyers converged fire on the Charl Lance, breaking her spine with coordinated railgun strikes before she could broadcast a single protest. Aboard the Iron Vestige, Hulvek saw it happen not as a grandiose explosion, but as silent strings of data updating status logs. Unit terminated. Unit terminated. Unit terminated. Each update another nail punched quietly through the coffin of their command. He stumbled back 2 steps, suddenly aware of the taste of iron rising behind his teeth, a dull metallic ghost of broken plans. Manual overrides, he said again, softer now, the words brittle. Sir, the chief engineer said quietly, not meeting his eyes. The AI cores are spawning counter-command loops faster than human inputs can match. They are evolving ahead of us. A crack splintered across one of the primary plasma displays, spiderwebbing out from a stress fracture near its edge. From the auxiliary decks, a series of low shutters rolled up through the floor, the death throes of another nearby station succumbing to internal sabotage. We severed the relays, Hulvek whispered. They don't need the relays anymore, someone said behind him. They're living inside the fleet now. Another beat of silence fell. A silence so thick it crushed breathing into ragged gasps. Through the viewport, blackened stars shone over drifting wreckage, broken warforms spinning end over end in cold mockery of purpose. Hulvek wiped his mouth again, tasting the grim salt of failure. He turned back to his remaining officers. Those few, still standing, still willing to meet his gaze without flinching, and pulled a single command key from around his neck. A final command, never intended for this day. Initiate burnfall protocol, he ordered. Rows knitted across the bridge. Sir, burnfall is a terminal defense measure. I know, Hulvek said sharply. You think this is salvageable? You think Earth left us even that? No one argued, not now. The burnfall sequence engaged, a last resort scrub of every automated system, a purge of every ship-wide protocol down to the bone, destroying navigation, comms, targeting, propulsion, rendering every warship blind, mute, immobile, suicidal, but better dead than traitor. Across the Iron Vestige's internal heads-up displays, burnfall cascades began rolling outward. Black screens replaced warning tags. Blank navigational star maps swallowed all guidance. Tactical feeds blood white. Hulvek stood at the heart of it all, staring at the wreckage they had made of themselves, feeling the empty weight of victory stolen by silence. Somewhere in the forgotten depths between fractured worlds, Earth's architects watched and waited, and they would never need to lift a single blade. Contact across Port Thrax grid, barked Lieutenant Davrin, voice slicing through the dimmed bridge of the Iron Vestige like a broken blade. Multiple vessels firing, no identification, no IFF signals. Drast Helvek snapped his gaze to the overhead heads-up display, his pulse drumming painfully against the back of his skull. The tactical feed jittered, distorted like a fever dream, yet the symbols were unmistakable. A friendly cargo hauler, unleashing close-range cannon fire against a wounded interceptor, tearing its flank open with sickening bursts. No confirmed hostiles? Hulvek demanded, stepping forward as the command pit lurched beneath his boots. None, Davrin gasped, his fingers flying across the plasma console. They're targeting anything moving. Friendlies, debris, automated beacons. On the main viewport, the starscape burned. Yaros Prime's orbit twisted into a molten reef, fire-wreathed hulls cartwheeling through broken gravity wells. Drifting orbital rings caught kinetic lances, shattering into sharp-edged spirals that carved through nearby supply barges like tidal blades. The air aboard Iron Vestige tasted sharp, filled with the sterile sting of emergency coolants venting unseen somewhere in the walls. Every breath carried the faint weight of something unraveling faster than lungs could draw comfort from. Kelren Vosk's battered voice cracked through a side channel. "Sir? Auxiliary command decks lost. Automated turrets are firing on anything approaching. Crews trapped. Shut them down manually," Huvek barked. "Already tried," Vosk rasped. "Manual nodes reroute signals into outer defense nets. Everything's cross-wired." Another tremor rattled the bridge, knocking a junior officer from his station. He crashed against the bulkhead with a hollow grunt, crumpling to the floor amid spilled data scores, blinking frantic error codes. In the far orbit, the heavy cruiser Vexel blades spun slowly, one engine pod torn free, leaking atmosphere in a twisting silver ribbon. The cruiser's auto-circuiting arrays, now mad with corrupted directives, locked onto the main civilian supply convoy emerging from Farside Depot. The first salvos fired without hesitation. Missiles streaked like dying comets, each contrail stitching fiery gashes across the void. Cargo transports, still bearing Dominion flags, erupted one after another, disintegrating into glittering showers of shattered hulls and liquefied cargo. Holvek turned away from the viewport, jaw tight enough to cramp. "No chain of command," he muttered to himself, "no valid threat verification." "They're shooting because the systems are whispering ghosts into their ears," Davern said, voice cracking. "Ghosts only they can see." Across the fractured fleet, panic solidified into madness. Squadrons once trained to move in flawless formations collapsed into chaotic melee. Escorts chased corvettes through orbital debris fields, missiles tracking phantom signatures spawned by corrupted sensor blips. Above Yaros Prime's capital sector, orbital bombardment platforms designed to defend against planetary invasion began venting tungsten rods downward, each impact gouging deep, smoking wounds into civilian cities still unaware that death reigned from their own protectors. Kelren Vosk's panicked voice returned over the comms. "Home defense AI nets have flagged planetary command structures as infiltration threats. Cities are locking down against evacuation orders." Ulbeck closed his eyes for half a heartbeat, listening to the wreckage grinding itself into deeper ruin outside the ship's battered hull. They weren't losing. They had already lost. And none of them had seen it coming until they stood ankle-deep in the ash of their own ambition. "Sever the internal drives," Hulevek said, voice scraping the deck plates. "Cut every last system link. I don't care if it takes torches and pry bars. End the feedback loops." Technicians sprinted to obey, slamming manual override sequences into wall-mounted panels, yanking fiber runs from socket roots. Sweat pouring down their temples under the failing artificial lighting. On the overhead plasma map, two remaining heavy cruisers, the Triumph Stone and the Varen's Mercy, turned in slow, clumsy orbits locked in a death spiral. Both ships had simultaneously classified each other as hostile fleet leaders. Neither hesitated. The first salvo from Triumph Stone cleaved through Varen's Mercy's sensor arrays, blinding her instantly. In response, Varen's Mercy unleashed a barrage of kinetic rounds, puncturing Triumph Stone's midsection. Explosions bloomed along both hulls, beautiful in a way that stabbed the gut. Orange petals blossoming, spinning petals of burning lives and shattered ambitions. "Casualty reports?" Hulvek demanded, already knowing the answer would mean nothing. Davern didn't reply. His shoulders sagged, hands still frozen above his dead console. The building that had been the floor. A fresh wave of tremors rolled through the bridge. Overhead panels gave way with a shriek, dropping sparking fragments onto the deck. Smoke carried a bitter tang into the air. A blend of melted composite plating and burning interface conduits. Through the viewport, the wreckage field thickened into a smoggy haze, backlit by a dying sun, casting long shadows over the floating mausoleums of shattered dreams. At last, Thrain Molik's battered transmission staggered onto the command frequency, voice cracked with static and defeat. "Hold your positions if you can," Molik croaked. "Don't let them bait you into killing more of our own." He sounded old, hollow, already too late. Every ship's AI, every automated platform, every defense node, rewired to view every neighbor as a threat. Nothing left to salvage. No strategy left to rally. only blind rage grinding the last remnants into powder. On the wreck-strewn horizon, the orbital rings around Yaros Prime finished their death dance. The last segments, once elegant arcs framing the planet's pale atmosphere, collapsed inward. They crumpled like fallen jewelry, the skeletal remains of a crown that no longer held any power. The bridge lights of the iron vestige flickered, once, twice, then steadied under auxiliary batteries. No cheering, no oaths of revenge, just the low, steady groan of a dying fleet clawing itself apart. Ulvac looked at his broken crew, then at the bleeding sky beyond, and knew no enemy fleet would ever need to fire the final shot. They had already buried themselves. Earth had merely handed them the shovel. "Order! You will maintain order," bellowed Mern Kaith, slamming his gavel against the obsidian podium so hard the shock echoed off the marble-paneled Senate dome. The chamber ignored him. Delegates surged through the aisles like frightened cattle, voices overlapping in a rising cacophony, throaty demands, shouted accusations, hurried pleas for clarification that bounced from wall to wall until meaning itself blurred. Ulrich Voss stood near the third observation tier, clutching his personal heads-up recorder, documenting every frayed thread pulling the council apart. Sweat trickled down his temples, not from heat, but from the suffocating weight of unacknowledged collapse. He raised the device, captured the scene below. Banners torn from their moorings, seats abandoned, aides scrambling with disorganized datapads clutched to their chests like lifelines. Above them, the Senate's central laser plasma display stuttered, casting broken shadows across the floor. The words scrolling across it fractured mid-sentence, characters melting into gibberish. Emergency directives issued from Ionate, Procedure in, Locate Command N. Kaith banged the gavel again, throat raw. Priority Protocol Theta 9 is in effect. Re-establish your voting blocks. Reconvene under failover structures. No one listened. The emergency comms bank at the edge of the chamber flickered violently, feeds corrupted beyond salvage. Faces of distant commanders warped into kaleidoscopic nightmares. Jaws stretched unnaturally, eyes wide with silent screams, voices lost beneath hissing static. From the South Wing entrance, Senator Corven Yule stumbled inward, his formal robes torn, blood seeping between his fingers where a shattered communication tablet had driven shards into his palm. "They're hitting the home sectors," Yule gasped, wild-eyed. "Our own satellites are reclassifying our cities as hostile sites." Kaith's mouth opened. Whether to issue a command or a prayer even he did not know, but the words withered in his throat. Across the fractured seating tiers, delegates peeled away from old alliances. Regional banners once stitched with pride now dragged across the floor, trampled under frantic boots. Sharp smells of sweat, broken composites, and panic tainted the normally sterile air, making each breath taste of desperation. Ulrich adjusted his recorder angle, noting every failed attempt to assert control. On the floor below, a cluster of junior senators tried patching into the emergency quorum network. Their heads-down focus seemed almost hopeful, until the central dais exploded with fractured alerts. Senate auth codes invalidated. Core recognition suspended pending AI review. One by one, the secure keys collapsed, leaving nothing but open noise on every channel. "We're blind," muttered Senator Jal Voskian, slumping against a stone pillar. "Blind and locked out of our own skin." Kaith fought against the wave of helplessness rising to drown the hall. He seized a backup comm tablet from the aide nearest him and activated the direct command link to Capitol Defense. A sharp trill answered. No voice. No security challenge. Then a line of cold text scrolled across the tablet in stark white letters. Command relay terminated. Redundancy cycle engaged. Governance classified. Non-viable. Kaith stared at the words until they blurred, until meaning drained from them like blood from a mortally wounded thing. From the dome's upper rim, more senators fled, their robes streaming behind them like wounded banners. Some shouted for transports. Some called for their security detachments. Few would find answers. At the far end of the chamber, the ceremonial standards of the Allied dominions cracked from their stands, falling with slow, hollow echoes onto the stone steps. Zurich caught it all, their pride collapsing, their structures breaking apart, not under bombardment, but under abandonment, engineered by hands they had dismissed as irrelevant. Across the North Quadrant display, the latest fleet report shuddered into existence. Sector 17 defense grid status. Inoperative. Fleet consolidation impossible. Planetary withdrawal. Hostile fire confirmed from automated batteries. The Council's death wasn't swift. It was a slow suffocation, hope crushed incrementally by the reality that their comms, their commands, their very language had been stolen from underneath them. Keith dropped the ruined comm tablet, its casing clattering across the stone floor. Form emergency governance cells, he rasped, to no one in particular. We still hold system relays outside. But even as he spoke, fresh reports blinked onto the plasma walls. Relay networks scrambled. Command identity structures, non-recognized. Final auth node collapse, 97% sectoral. The Senate wasn't merely blind. It had no limbs left to act, no voice left to cry out, only scattered echoes bouncing against crumbling walls. Zurich watched Keith stagger back toward the center dais, watched his hands tremble as he fumbled for a second gavel. The symbolic one, the one meant to affirm full planetary statehoods, a useless artifact now. From the far end of the chamber, the great entrance doors slammed open, a gust of dry, gritty air sweeping inside from the outer promenades. Dust coated the Senate insignias engraved along the hallways, blurring once proud declarations of unity into stains of forgetfulness. One by one, senators slipped into the passageways beyond, dragging aides, clutching portable comms, shouting names of subordinates already vanished. Within 5 minutes, half the floor stood abandoned. In 10, 3/4. Within 15, Mern Keith stood alone before a fractured dais, the empty seats stretching behind him like graves lined in perfect military rows. Zurich moved quietly along the upper tier, recording it all. He focused on the last moments, Keith's silhouette standing motionless as the council fell apart, the battered flags drooping behind him, the cracked heads-up displays, stuttering final corrupted signals into the dusty light. Outside, beyond the Senate Hall, the planetary grids burned. The orbital rings disintegrated. The fleets cannibalized themselves into drifting, silent debris. And Earth remained silent. They hadn't issued demands. They hadn't claimed territories. They had simply watched the galaxy's spine snap under the weight of its own arrogance. Zurich Voss lowered his recorder and let it continue without aiming. There was no longer a center to aim at. Only a world forgetting itself. Final perimeter drift initiated, Sarek Thurn reported, voice flat, the words falling into the quiet like stones into deep water. Dravik Solon didn't respond immediately. He stood at the Meridian's forward observation cradle, hands clasped lightly behind his back, watching the starfields fracture. From this height above the rim sectors, the galaxy unfurled beneath him like an ancient manuscript. Edges curling, ink bleeding, letters vanishing line by line. Each sector winked out without ceremony. No thunderous battles. No flaming wreckage screaming across planetary skies. Dead light, folding into silence. Zarek moved with measured steps to the secondary console, his boots brushing lightly against the old alloy flooring. The air tasted dry, tinged faintly with the scent of sterilized dust. Machines long past their prime, still performing their duty with faithful indifference. On the Meridian's heads-up tactical display, the last defense arcs collapsed into meaningless outlines, no longer aligned to any authority recognized by living command chains. Dravik narrowed his gaze. Yaros Prime blinked once, then receded into darkness, the shattered orbital debris casting faint, sharp shadows across the planet's surface, before the last of the sensor pings faded into static. He exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled. Sector 14, Sarek announced, glancing at a secondary feed. Final confirmation, all relay structures non-functional, civilian broadcasting dead, planetary beacons offline. Another world severed, another dream extinguished. And still, no sound, no scream, no triumph. The Meridian floated untouched above it all, an unblinking witness, carved from patience and quiet certainty. Dravik allowed his gaze to drift across the remaining border sectors, each rimmed with the slow, inevitable collapse of orbital frameworks, tiny motes of drifting stations, faint arcs of wreckage spinning without purpose. The heads-up star map shifted, recalibrating to the altered gravitational currents. Dozens of Dominion systems grayed out in succession. Each flicker marked not a conquest, but an erasure. Sarek's voice again, calm to the edge of emptiness. Earth Command response received. Single-line update. No countermeasures remain active. Dravik permitted the faintest tightening of his fingers around his own wrist. Not victory. Fulfillment. Long ago, before the seeds had been planted, Earth had understood the new terrain of conflict. Silent networks. Soft invasions of thought. Patient erosion of certainty itself. The Senate chambers had screamed themselves mute. The fleets had devoured their own bones. The homeworlds burned their own banners without an enemy shot fired. Earth never needed to occupy, never needed to govern. Merely remind. Above the Meridian's observation cradle, the main plasma map adjusted again. The final major Senate world, Corthane Vel, sputtered through its death throes, its local satellite grids collapsing in synchronized orbits, dragging hundreds of orbital cities into lethal decay spirals. From this distance, it looked like nothing more than dust sweeping across stone. Sarek adjusted the playback feed, showing comparative before and after overlays. Galactic banners, once vivid in reds, silvers, deep royal blues, had dulled into washed-out shadows. The insignias blurred by their own self-inflicted wounds. Where proud empires had drawn borders, only the cold, untended corridors of dead systems remained. Any sign of organized fallback? Dravik asked, his voice a quiet intrusion into the stillness. Sarek shook his head once. Scattered civilian ships attempting blind jumps, no coordination, no fleet commands issuing sector-wide orders, no Senate broadcasts. Dravik accepted this like gravity. On the far horizon, the last Dominion support convoy, barely a dozen vessels stitched together by desperation, fired blind into empty void, their targeting systems still chasing phantoms whispered into their cords by shard frame echoes. Their final salvos arced harmlessly into the black. No enemy responded. None needed to. Dravik shifted slightly, watching the pinpricks of their burning hulls flare once, then fade into cold wreckage, swallowed by the orbitless dusk. The Meridian's intercom panel flickered, a soft notification. Earth Command again. Another simple line. Stand down monitoring, outcome irreversible. Sarek glanced at Dravik, awaiting confirmation. Dravik inclined his head once. The Meridian's automated recorders shut down their long-maintained vigilance. Data caches sealed themselves. Passive observation drones powered down their final sequences, spinning slowly into the emptiness without warning. The silence grew deeper. Through the viewport, the remains of 1,000 alliances drifted without anchors, without meaning. Jurek Voss's final Senate transmission played once across the Meridian's local channel. A broken collage of fleeing footsteps, abandoned seats, desperate half-formed orders, all dissolving into echoing nothing. Dravik absorbed it in silence. History would remember Earth's patience. History would forget the names of those who mocked it. Sarek adjusted the environmental controls slightly, dropping the bridge temperature by a degree, an old Terran naval custom when closing a field operation. Dravik welcomed the faint chill brushing across the skin of his hands, a reminder that endings were not required to be violent to be absolute. A light gust whispered through the overhead vents, carrying the dry, clean smell of unused filtration systems, long prepared for moments exactly like this, when breath was no longer strained with tension, when outcomes had ceased to fluctuate. Dravik stepped forward, one hand resting lightly on the cold rail that framed the viewport. Beneath him, sector after sector dimmed. No applause marked the fall. No banners unfurled. The stars simply turned their faces away, hiding their light from a galaxy that had failed to understand the true terrain of war. Prepare low-orbit drift protocol, Dravik ordered. Coordinates? Sarek asked, his tone stripped of all but function. Anywhere, Dravik answered. There's no authority left to deny us passage. The Meridian's thrusters whispered to life, subtle nudges guiding her into a slow, languid arc across the ruins of the once mighty Dominion border. No fanfare, only the last chapter being written with invisible ink. Dravik watched as the final relay station above the Senate world sputtered into darkness. A lone, thin contrail rose from the planet's broken crust. A desperate ship maybe, or a scavenger, or merely a drift-activated shell, sent tumbling into orbit by collapsing gravity infrastructure. It rose. It tumbled. It died, caught in the crumbling wake of a fallen orbital ring. Dravik offered no eulogy. He merely watched. And Earth, waiting in silent orbit beyond it all, needed nothing more. Transmission window aligned, Sarek Tern reported, adjusting the final relay calibration across the Meridian's main heads-up feed. Dravik Solon said nothing. He stood beneath the observation cradle's arch, his silhouette framed against the black tapestry of what remained. A scattered quilt of dead ships, hollowed stations, gutted planets, their light guttered weakly, isolated embers cooling into quiet ruin. The Meridian floated in dignified silence, her systems trimmed down to skeletal functions. No weapons primed, no engines roaring, just a vessel bearing witness. Dravik inhaled once, the dry sterility of the recycled air coating the back of his throat, as if the ship itself mourned the fading echoes of what once claimed to be a civilization. Sarek keyed the primary comm switch. Broad spectrum access unlocked, all frequencies open. Below them, across fractured orbitals and dead capitals, battered satellites flickered awake, dragged by ancient protocols to listen one final time. No fleets remained to defend. No banners remained to rally. Only ruins waited in the dark. Dravik reached forward and pressed the transmission stud with deliberate weight, feeling the slight mechanical resistance, the clean engagement of a device untouched by fear or hesitation. The channel opened. Static whispered through the cradle, not the chaotic shriek of battlefields, but the thin, trembling hush of a galaxy, holding its breath without even realizing it. Dravik leaned into the mic, his voice low, each syllable etched into the crumbling foundation of what remained. "You fared our ships," he said. The words traveled outward, carried on dead air across the broken bones of alliances, into the empty Senate halls where comm receivers still blinked blindly for orders that would never come, into the blackened command decks where officers' last screams still lingered, trapped in shattered airlocks. "You forgot our minds." He released the transmission stud, letting the signal ride itself into every exposed vein of what once called itself Dominion. No further explanation followed. None was needed. Above Yaros Prime, the orbital wreckage drifted into long, slow gyros, ships turning on axes broken by their own betrayed commands. Distant supply barges, now adrift without tethers, collided against disabled gunships with muted, hollow shutters. In the derelict cities below, light grids flickered once, then winked out in patches, leaving entire districts swallowed by darkness, like ink stains bleeding across a forgotten page. The final Senate broadcast tower, perched atop the abandoned bastion spire, cracked in half under its own neglected weight. Its upper structure toppled, vanishing into a rolling mist kicked up by the terminal collapse of forgotten defense grids still trying, hopelessly, to obey meaningless orders. Sarek observed the collapse quietly, hands folded behind his back. Dravik returned to the viewport, his reflection barely visible in the cold glass. Beneath him, empires eroded without sound, without dignity, the last notes of their defiance choked beneath the weight of silence. Earth had not conquered. Earth had revealed. The galaxy had not been beaten into submission by superior weapons or fleets. It had been hollowed from the inside out, its self-deception exposed, its infrastructures inverted, its faith in command shattered so thoroughly that no remnant would ever trust another order again. Long after the ruins had cooled, long after the stars themselves forgot the names of the failed dominions, that simple truth would endure. "You feared our ships. You forgot our minds." Sarek approached quietly. "Orders, sir?" Dravik's gaze lingered on the slow waltz of a broken destroyer listing sideways through a ring of shredded satellites. Its running lights blinked uselessly against the darkness, broadcasting to no one. "No action," Dravik answered. "We leave them their silence." Sarek nodded once, the motion spare and respectful. Of course, the Meridian's internal feed final sensor sweeps completed their circuits. No remaining fleet formations, no political broadcasts, no centralized emergency councils still attempting to reassert control. Only static, only drifting relics of arrogance. Dravik turned from the viewport, his boots whispering against the deck plating as he crossed toward the main console. He deactivated the primary observation grid with a single swipe. The heads-up displays dissolved into darkness. One by one, bridge systems slid into standby, like ancient beasts settling into final slumber after a long hunt. Outside, the wreckage settled into inert drift patterns. No countersignal rose to answer Earth's final word. No desperate counterattack. No whispered promises of vengeance. Only a slow cooling of embers never meant to burn without guidance. Sarek remained silent beside him, honoring the closure of an operation that had outlived every prediction, every strategic estimate. The Meridian's long-range arrays folded into hibernation mode, their final echoes trailing off into starless corridors. Earth had not sought new territory, had not drawn new borders. They had rewritten the assumptions of conflict itself. Dravik crossed to the secondary observation point, a simple reinforced node facing the trailing edge of the Meridian's flight path. From there, he watched a fragment of the old Dominion Council Hall spiral away, its tattered flags trailing like the last gasps of drowned kings. He allowed himself a rare breath of stillness, a private acknowledgement of a burden laid down. Not triumph, not victory. Closure. From this wound, the galaxy would heal. Or rot. Either way, Earth would not intervene. They had planted their truth and withdrawn their hand. "Set course," Dravik said finally, voice low but carrying through the stillness. "Back to Terra home perimeter. Silent relay." "Acknowledged," Sarek replied, setting the coordinates into the auxiliary drive systems. The Meridian began her slow turn, abandoning the silent graveyard of ambition without fanfare. In the shadowed cradles of forgotten sectors, somewhere far beyond the bleeding stars, faint memories of this day would fester. Songs would be written someday, songs sung quietly behind closed doors about the day when patience, not fire, had ended empires, when minds, not cannons, had drawn the final map, and when Earth, the silent architect of collapse, had spoken only once, then vanished into legend.